Hey guys, tonight we step into the sun-drenched hills of ancient Greece, where massive temples gleam against the sky, their marble columns practically glowing with stories. Picture yourself wandering through olive groves, the air thick with dust, and the distant clang of chisels. These aren't just buildings, they're the Greeks' way of shouting to the gods. We're here, and we're serious. But let's be real. If you tried hauling one of those stone blocks without a crane, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease in to tonight's journey together. You're standing in Athens, 5th century BCE, staring up at the Parthenon, its Doric columns looming like giants. Why did the Greeks pour their hearts, sweat, and gold into temples like this? It's not just about pretty architecture, though wow, it's gorgeous. These structures were their Wi-Fi to the divine, connecting mortals to gods like Zeus, Athena, or Apollo. The Greeks believed their deities demanded worship and not some half-baked altar in a backyard. No, the gods wanted grandeur, something to match their cosmic egos. A mainstream fact, the Parthenon, built between 447 and 432 BCE, was dedicated to Athena, Athens' patron goddess, to thank her for victory over the Persians. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some temples doubled as banks, storing city wealth in their cellas, because who's gonna rob a god's house? Historians still argue whether these temples were more about spiritual devotion or showing off civic power. You wander closer, running your fingers over the cool marble. The Greeks didn't just slap these together. Every temple was a calculated flex, religious, cultural, political. They built them to last, to scream immortality in a world where wars and earthquakes could wipe out a city overnight. Imagine the logistics. No power tools, no trucks, just oxen, ropes, and sheer stubbornness. You'd be exhausted just watching. And yet, they didn't stop at functional. Temples like the Parthenon were designed with optical tricks, columns slightly curved to look straight from afar. It's like the Greeks were trolling physics itself. Bet they'd laugh at our modern, minimalist sheds. You pause at the temple's edge, catching the scent of incense wafting from within. The Greeks saw temples as houses for their god statues, not churches for congregations. You wouldn't find pews or sermons here, just priests, offerings, and the occasional goat sacrifice. Gross, but effective. The real action happened outside, where festivals and processions turn the temple grounds into a community hub. Think Coachella, but with more togas and fewer influencers. Why so grand, though? Because the Greeks believed a shabby temple might tick off the gods, bringing storms or plagues. No pressure, right? You chuckle, imagining Zeus yeeting a lightning bolt at a poorly built shrine. As you step back, the Parthenon silhouette burns into your mind, a symbol of a civilization obsessed with pleasing the divine while flexing their own genius. And this is just the start. You're still in Athens, the Parthenon's shadow stretching long as the sun dips low. The air hums with distant chants, and you can almost feel the gods' eyes on you. Why did the Greeks make their temples so outrageously grand? It's not just aesthetics. It's because the gods demanded it, and these folks weren't about to skimp on divine interior decorators. You're about to dive into the heavenly expectations that drove every chisel and marble slab. Walk with me toward the temple's entrance, where the scent of olive oil and burnt offerings lingers. The Greeks believed their gods weren't just chilling on Mount Olympus eating ambrosia. They were watching, judging, and occasionally meddling. A mainstream fact, temples like the one at Delphi, home to Apollo's oracle, were built to house sacred statues and serve as divine hotlines. If you wanted advice on war or marriage, you'd trek to a temple, offer a gift, and hope for a cryptic riddle in return. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some Greeks thought gods physically visited their temples, so they'd leave out snacks like honey cakes to keep them happy. Imagine Zeus popping by for a midnight munch. Historians still argue whether these offerings were pure devotion or a way to bribe the gods for favors. You step closer, dodging a stray goat that's probably not long for this world. The gods' demands shaped every detail of these shrines. Temples weren't just big, they were obsessively precise. The Greeks used sacred proportions, like the golden ratio, to make buildings feel divine. It's like they thought Athena would personally measure the columns with a cosmic ruler. You smirk, picturing her with a clipboard, docking points for sloppy masonry. But this wasn't just superstition. Temples were a contract. You build something epic, and maybe Poseidon doesn't sink your ships. Skimp on quality, and you're begging for a tsunami. Now, picture the priests bustling around, their robes swishing as they prep for a festival. The gods didn't just want fancy houses. They wanted constant attention, sacrifices, hymns, processions. These were non-negotiable. You'd see whole communities turn out, waving olive branches and singing loud enough to wake Hades. It's less peaceful worship and more divine rock concert. The grander the temple, the louder the message. We respect you, Please don't smite us. You can't help but laugh, imagining a god rolling their eyes at yet another cow on the altar. As you circle the temple, you notice the intricate friezes, gods and heroes carved in marble, glowing in the dusk. These weren't just decor, they were propaganda for the divine order. The Greeks believed their gods craved beauty as much as obedience. A shabby temple was an insult, like serving a king dinner on paper plates. And the gods weren't exactly forgiving. Stories circulated of cities struck by plagues after neglecting their shrines. You wince, thinking of the poor architect who cut corners and woke up to a lightning-fried roof. The pressure was real. You pause, leaning against a column, its fluted surface cool under your palm. The gods' demands didn't just shape temples, they shaped Greek life. Every festival, every sacrifice, every perfectly aligned stone was a plea for divine favor. You glance up, half expecting to see Athena's owl swooping overhead, checking the construction progress. The Greeks built grand because anything less felt like tempting fate. And honestly, with gods this dramatic, can you blame them? As the stars begin to peek out, you're ready to uncover what made these temples architectural marvels. You're back in the glow of an ancient Greek temple, its marble catching the last rays of sunlight. The Parthenon looms nearby, but now you're zeroing in on the sheer genius of how these structures were built. It's not just that the Greeks made temples grand, it's that they made them impossibly perfect, like they were flexing for the gods and eternity. You're about to marvel at the architectural brilliance that turned stone into sacred art. Step onto the temple's platform, the stylobate, and feel its slight upward curve under your sandals. A mainstream fact: Greek architects like Iktinos, who designed the Parthenon, used entasis, subtle column tapering, to create optical illusions of perfection. Nothing's truly straight. It's all a trick to make the temple look flawless from every angle. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some temples, like the one at Bassae, were built with misaligned foundations to confuse evil spirits. Imagine an architect muttering, "Take that, ghosts," while eyeballing a wonky cornerstone. Historians still argue whether these design quirks were spiritual safeguards or just practical fixes for uneven terrain. You run your hand along a column, its flutes carved so precisely you'd think they used lasers. The Greeks had no heavy machinery, just bronze tools, ropes, and grit. Picture workers hauling 20-ton blocks up ramps, sweating under the Attic sun. You'd probably fake a sprained ankle to skip that shift. Yet they aligned stones to within millimeters, using nothing but plumb lines and pure math. The Doric order, sturdy, no nonsense, gave temples like the Parthenon their iconic look. while Ionic's curvy elegance jazzed up shrines like the Erechtheion. It's like the Greeks were saying, we can do tough and pretty. Now, squint at the roofline. See those triglyphs and metopes? They're not just decor. They mimic wooden beams from older, humbler temples. The Greeks loved nostalgia, dressing their marble masterpieces in fake wood vibes. You chuckle, imagining a mason carving a retro beam while sipping proto-coffee. But don't let the charm fool you. Temples were engineering feats. They withstood earthquakes thanks to clever jointing, with no mortar, just metal clamps hidden in the stone. You'd need a PhD to pull that off today. Wander to the temple cella, where the god statue would gleam. The interior was dim, smoky from incense, but the exterior, a sunlit spectacle. Architects obsessed over proportions, using ratios like 1:2 for length and width to create harmony. It's borderline obsessive, like they thought Apollo would smite them for bad feng shui. And color. Temples weren't ghostly white. They were painted in reds, blues, and golds, loud as a festival float. You wince, picturing the Parthenon as a giant candy cane. Good thing time toned it down. As you step back, the temple symmetry hits you. Every angle, every curve was calculated to awe. The Greeks didn't just build for the gods. They built to outsmart nature itself, crafting structures that looked eternal, even as empires crumbled. You glance at a cracked column, wondering how many storms it's seen. The brilliance wasn't just in the stones, but in the minds that shaped them. And yet, these temples weren't just about beauty. They were about power too. You're ready to see how they became city-state bragging rights. You're still soaking in the Parthenon's glow, its columns standing like silent sentinels over Athens. But now you're noticing the buzz beyond the temple. Merchants haggling, politicians strutting, and rival city-states envoys side-eyeing the grandeur. The Greeks didn't just build temples to please the gods. These marble giants were flexes of civic pride, screaming, "Our city's better than yours." You're about to see how temples became status symbols in a world of cutthroat competition. Stroll down the Acropolis, where Athens' skyline broadcasts its dominance. A mainstream fact, the Parthenon, funded by the Delian League's treasury, was a deliberate show of Athenian wealth and power after the Persian Wars. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some smaller cities, like Aegina, built mini-temples just to keep up, like the kid at school bragging about his almost as cool sneakers. Historians still argue whether these temples were genuine piety or propaganda to outshine rivals like Sparta or Corinth. You dodge a cart of olives, catching snippets of gossip about Thebes' latest shrine. City-states were like ancient influencers, obsessed with clout. A grand temple wasn't just a building, it was a billboard. Athens splashed cash on the Parthenon to rub its naval empire in everyone's faces. Meanwhile, Sparta, all about grit over glitz, stuck to simpler shrines, probably rolling their eyes at Athens' marble obsession. You snicker, imagining a Spartan muttering, "Fancy columns won't win wars." But even they knew a good temple boosted morale and intimidated foes. Picture the Panathenaic festival, where Athenians paraded to the Parthenon, waving banners like it was the Olympics opening ceremony. These events weren't just religious, they were PR stunts. A shiny temple drew pilgrims, traders, and prestige, like hosting the Super Bowl. You'd see rival delegates from Delphi or Olympia, pretending not to be impressed while mentally upping their own temple budgets. It's peak ancient shade, and you're here for it. Now, lean against a wall, feeling the city's pulse. Temples were economic engines, too. Building one meant jobs, masons, sculptors, even snack vendors for the workers. A big temple could put your city on the map, pulling in tourist drachmas. But the cost? Eye-watering. Athens funneled war spoils and taxes into the Parthenon, sparking grumbles from allies who wanted that cash for ships, not statues. You wince, picturing the budget meetings, probably more brutal than the battles. As you gaze across the city, you spot smaller altars dotting the hills, each a mini flex of local pride. Every polis wanted its own Parthenon, even if it was just a cute temple-ette. This wasn't just about gods, it was about identity. A grand temple said, "We're Athens, and we're untouchable," or Corinth, or whoever had the most marble that year. You chuckle, thinking of the one-upmanship, like cities trading diss tracks in stone. But temples weren't just for show. They were alive with rituals. You're ready to step inside and join the sacred ceremonies that made these places hum. You're at the foot of a Greek temple, the Parthenon's grandeur still lingering in your mind. But now you're drawn to the energy pulsing around it. The air crackles with anticipation. Crowds gather, torches flicker, and the scent of roasted meat wafts from altars. Temples weren't just pretty stone piles. They were the beating heart of sacred ceremonies that brought the Greeks closer to their gods. You're about to join the rituals that made these places come alive. Step into the crowd, elbowing past a guy waving an olive branch like it's a concert glow stick. A mainstream fact, temples hosted major festivals like the Panathenea in Athens, where thousands honored Athena with processions, sacrifices, and athletic contests. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some rituals included sacred cakes shaped like snakes or body parts, offered to gods for healing. Imagine praying for a bad knee with a pastry kneecap. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were deeply spiritual or just elaborate excuses for a citywide party. You shuffle forward, the altar's heat prickling your skin. Temples were stages for devotion. Outside, priests in flowing robes slit a bull's throat. Sorry, it's grim, but that's the gig. It's blood, an offering to appease Zeus or Apollo. You wince, wishing they'd stuck to fruit baskets. The crowd chants, their voices rising to the stars, believing the gods are listening. Inside the cella, a golden statue of the deity glimmers, incense curling around it like a divine Instagram filter. You'd snap a pic, but, no phones. Now, picture the procession snaking up the Acropolis. Girls carrying woven peplous robes as gifts for Athena's statue. It's less solemn march and more fashion show with extra piety. You grin, imagining a priest tripping over his hem and blaming Hermes. These rituals weren't just for show. They unified people, farmers, sailors, even the occasional philosopher like Socrates, all joined in, bonding over shared faith and free festival food. Temples turned strangers into a community, at least until the wine ran out. As you weave through the throng, you spot dancers twirling to flute music, their moves as hypnotic as the firelight. Rituals varied. Delphi's oracle whispered prophecies, while Eleusis hosted secret rites promising afterlife perks. Secrecy level, Fight Club, but with more mystery. You'd love to sneak in, but the guards look like they mean business. Every ceremony, from blood offerings to hymn singing, was about keeping the gods happy. A grand temple amplified the vibe, making the rituals feel cosmic, like you're part of something bigger than Athens or even Greece. You pause, the crowd's energy buzzing in your chest. Temples weren't churches, they were portals. The Greeks believed their gods noticed every sacrifice, every prayer. A shabby shrine might get you ignored, or worse, smited. You chuckle, picturing Poseidon ghosting a poorly planned festival. These grand spaces made rituals unforgettable, etching devotion into marble and memory. As the crowd disperses, you're left wondering about the wealth that fueled this splendor. Time to trace the money behind these marble marvels. You're lingering near the temple, the echo of festival chants fading as the stars take over the Greek sky. The Parthenon's marble gleams, and you're struck by its sheer excess. Every column, every frieze screams money. These temples weren't just divine fan mail. They were cash sinks, built on wealth that could have fed armies. You're about to trace the drachmas, gold, and sweat that turned rocky hills into marble marvels. Wander toward the Acropolis edge, where you can almost hear the clink of coins. A mainstream fact: Athens funded the Parthenon using tribute from the Delian League, a coalition turned ATM after the Persian Wars. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some temples, like Artemis's at Ephesus, were partly bankrolled by wealthy widows donating their jewelry. Picture a priest awkwardly accepting a gold necklace while muttering, Artemis says thanks. Historians still argue whether this was pious generosity or a flex to secure social clout. You kick a pebble, imagining the logistics. Building a temple was like producing a Hollywood blockbuster with no CGI. Marble came from quarries miles away. Pentelic for the Parthenon, glowing like it was kissed by Helios. Workers hauled it by ox cart, cursing every rut. Labor wasn't cheap. Skilled masons earned more than soldiers. You smirk, thinking of a sculptor demanding overtime while Zeus's statue waits half-carved. Then there's the gold and ivory for cult statues, imported at eye-watering cost. Athens once melted down temple treasures to fund wars. Talk about divine budget cuts. Now picture the bureaucrats tallying costs. Temples ate up taxes, war spoils, even pirate loot in some cases. Smaller cities begged rich patrons to chip in, promising their names on a plaque, or at least a nod from Apollo. It's like ancient crowdfunding, but with more goats. You'd bet some shady contractors skimmed off the top, blaming supply chain issues for missing marble. The wealth wasn't just in materials. Temples stored city treasuries in their cellas, guarded by gods and grumpy priests. Robbing one was a one-way ticket to divine wrath. As you circle the temple, you spot workers polishing a frieze, their lamps casting shadows. The economy hummed around these projects. Quarrymen, carpenters, even tavern owners feeding the crews, all thrived. A grand temple was a stimulus package, pumping drachmas into every corner of the polis. But the cost sparked fights. Allies grumbled when Athens diverted league funds to gild Athena's statue instead of building ships. You wince, imagining the diplomatic shade thrown at those meetings. You lean against a column, its cool surface grounding you. The wealth behind these temples wasn't just about showing off. It was about faith, power, and survival. A grand temple told the gods, "We're worth your protection," and rivals, "Don't mess with us." You chuckle, picturing a treasurer fainting at the final bill. But all that gold and marble needed art to shine. You're ready to admire the sculptures that made these sacred spaces pop. You're back at the temple, the Parthenon silhouette sharp against the twilight. Your eyes drift to the intricate carvings dancing across its surface. Commods, heroes, and mythical beasts frozen in marble. These temples weren't just grand for their size. They were galleries of jaw-dropping art, every sculpture a love letter to the gods, and a flex of Greek skill. You're about to admire the masterpieces that turn sacred spaces into visual symphonies. Step closer to the pediment, where figures seem to leap from the stone. A mainstream fact, the Parthenon sculptures, crafted under Phidias' direction, included 92 metopes depicting battles like Greeks versus Amazons, symbolizing order over chaos. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some temple friezes hid cheeky details, like a carved dog chasing its tail at Bassi, probably an artist's inside joke. Historians still argue whether these artworks were purely devotional or sneaky propaganda for city pride. You squint at a frieze, catching Athena mid-stride, her robe rippling like it's caught in a breeze. The Greeks didn't mess around. Sculptors chiseled marble so finely you'd swear the figures breathed. These weren't just decorations. They told stories. Pediments showed myths, like Zeus battling titans, while friezes captured festivals, with mortals and gods mingling. You grin, imagining a sculptor slipping their own face into a crowd scene, hoping Athena wouldn't notice. The statues weren't shy either. Many were painted in bold reds and blues, making temples pop like ancient comic books. Bet that color scheme gave visitors whiplash. Now, slip into the Sala, where the cult statue looms. Phidias' Athena Parthenos, 40 feet tall, gleamed with ivory skin and gold armor, holding a Nike so detailed you'd think it could fly. Crafting her took years and a fortune. Talk about a divine glow-up. You'd need sunglasses to handle the bling. Smaller temples had humbler statues, but even those were carved with obsessive care. Every fold and muscle a nod to the god's perfection. Sculptors were rock stars. Their work worshipped as much as the deities. As you circle back outside, you spot workers touching up a centaur's hoof. Temples were art hubs, employing armies of craftsmen. Some signed their work, rare for the time, like graffiti artists tagging a masterpiece. You chuckle, picturing a sculptor carving, "Phidias was here," under Athena's sandal. But this art wasn't just for beauty. It shaped belief. A stunning statue made the gods feel real, close enough to touch. No wonder pilgrims wept at first sight. You pause, the marble cool under your palm. These sculptures weren't static. They were alive with meaning, tying Greeks to their myths and each other. A grand temple without art was like a festival without music. Unthinkable. You glance at a chipped nymph, wondering who carved her centuries ago. But art wasn't the only power play here. Temples were also political chess moves. You're ready to link these shrines to the ambitions of rulers and elites. You're still basking in the Parthenon's glow, its sculptures glinting under the moon. But now you sense a different energy, whispers of power plays and political maneuvering. These temples weren't just for gods or art. They were tools for rulers and elites to flex their clout and shape the Greek world. You're about to link these grand shrines to the ambitions of the powerful. Stroll down the Acropolis, where politicians in crisp tunics debate loudly, their gestures as dramatic as the friezes. A mainstream fact: Pericles, Athens' golden boy, championed the Parthenon's construction in the 5th century BCE to cement his legacy and Athens' dominance. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some tyrants, like Polycrates of Samos, built massive temples to distract restless citizens, like throwing a shiny party to dodge a coup. Historians still argue whether these projects were visionary leadership or ego-driven propaganda. You weave through the crowd, catching a whiff of ambition as thick as the incense. Temples were political billboards. A leader who bankrolled one, like Pericles with his Delian League funds, could claim divine favor and public adoration. It's like naming a stadium after yourself, but holier. You smirk, imagining Pericles posing for a statue, muttering, "Make me look humble, but not too humble." Rivals weren't fooled. Sparta grumbled that Athens' temple spree was a power grab dressed in piety. They weren't wrong. Picture the assembly where funds were approved. Elites pushed temple projects to boost their status, outshining lesser nobles or rival cities. A grand shrine could sway allies or intimidate foes, like a marble middle finger to Corinth. You'd bet some debates got heated, with orators accusing each other of wasting gold on Athena's new dress. Temples also centralized power. Control the sacred site. Control the narrative. Priests, often elite cronies, wielded influence, deciding which offerings please the gods. Shady? Maybe. As you lean against a column, you spot a diplomat from Thebes eyeing the Parthenon, probably calculating how to top it. Temples were diplomatic chess pieces, too. A city with a stunning shrine drew envoys and pilgrims, amplifying its soft power. But the cost sparked backlash. Ordinary Greeks sometimes rioted over taxes funneled to marble instead of bread. You wince, picturing a farmer shaking his fist at yet another divine statue. Power came with a price. You glance up. The temple silhouette, a reminder of human ambition as much as divine worship. Rulers built grand to etch their names in history, using gods as their alibi. You chuckle, thinking of Pericles' ghost high-fiving Athena for the PR win. But temples weren't just elite toys. They were the glue of Greek identity. You're ready to grasp their role in unifying a fractious culture. You're still on the Acropolis, the Parthenon's marble glowing softly under a starlit sky. The political buzz fades, replaced by a deeper hum. voices of Greeks from Athens to Sparta, united by something bigger than rivalries. Temples weren't just power plays or art galleries. They were the cultural core, weaving a shared identity across a fractured land. You're about to grasp how these grand shrines shaped what it meant to be Greek. Wander through the temple grounds, where pilgrims from distant palais mingle, their dialects blending like a Mediterranean mixtape. A mainstream fact, temples like Delphi's, home to Apollo's oracle, served as pan-Hellenic hubs, drawing Greeks for festivals and consultations since the 8th century BCE. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some temples hosted sacred truces during games like the Olympics, pausing wars so enemies could high-five over a shared altar. Historians still argue whether these moments were heartfelt unity or just a time out to flex cultural pride. You brush past a family offering a clay figurine, their devotion as real as the stone beneath you. Temples were more than buildings. They were anchors. Greece wasn't a nation, but a patchwork of city-states, each with its own laws and grudges. Yet, everyone revered the same gods, told the same myths. A grand temple, whether Zeus's at Olympia or Artemis's at Ephesus, was a shared stage. You grin, picturing a Spartan and an Athenian bonding over bad festival food, muttering, "The souvlaki's overcooked." These shrines gave Greeks a common script. Now imagine standing at Delphi, the navel of the world, where a priestess' cryptic words guided kings and farmers alike. Temples standardized belief, same rituals, same hymns, same slightly creepy goat sacrifices. You'd probably stick to the hymns. They also preserve stories, their friezes carving myths into collective memory. Every Greek knew Athena's owl or Poseidon's trident, like cultural emojis. Temples were the internet before Wi-Fi, spreading ideas across mountains and seas. As you sit on a step, the night air cool, you see kids playing near an altar, mimicking a procession. Temples shaped values, honor, piety, community. Festivals taught young Greeks to celebrate together, even if they'd bicker later. The grandeur made it stick. A tiny shrine wouldn't inspire epic poems or pilgrimages. You chuckle, imagining a poet scrapping an ode to a shack-sized temple. These spaces weren't just religious, they were Greekness itself, binding a people who loved to argue. You glance at the Parthenon, its columns like pillars of identity. Temples reminded Greeks they were part of something vast, despite their squabbles. That unity, fragile as it was, carried their culture through wars and time. But their story doesn't end here. You're ready to reflect on the enduring grandeur of these temples in our modern world. You're back at the Parthenon, its marble now a ghostly white, under the moonlight, standing like a sentinel over Athens' past. The air feels heavy with centuries, and you're tracing the threads of why these temples, so grand, still haunt our imagination. Their stones whisper of gods, ambition, and a culture that refuses to fade. You're about to reflect on the enduring legacy of these Greek marvels. Step softly across the Acropolis, where the Parthenon's silhouette feels both ancient and alive. A mainstream fact: Greek temples, like the Parthenon, inspired Western architecture, from Rome's Pantheon to modern courthouses with their columned facades. But here's a quirky tidbit. 19th century romantics sometimes borrowed temple marbles like Lord Elgin, sparking debates that still rage in museums. Historians still argue whether these temples' grandeur lies more in their original purpose or their afterlife as global icons. You pause, imagining the Parthenon in its prime, painted bright, bustling with festivals. It's not just a ruin, it's a time machine. These temples shaped how we see the beauty, from the golden ratio in art to the columns on your local bank. They're Instagram famous before cameras, drawing travelers then and now. You smirk, picturing a toga-clad influencer posing with Athena's statue. Hashtag blessed by Zeus. Their scale still awes. Tourists gape where pilgrims once prayed, chasing the same wonder you felt at that first glimpse of marble. Now picture the ideas these temples carried. Democracy, born in Athens' shadow, owes a nod to the civic pride that built them. Their art and math seeded Renaissance studios and Silicon Valley algorithms. You'd bet Phidias would love a 3D printer. Temples also taught us preservation. Every crack tells a story of wars, quakes, and time's relentless march. Yet they stand, defiant, reminding you nothing's truly immortal. But some things come close. As you sit on a worn step, the city's hum below feels distant. These temples aren't just Greek, they're human, proof we can build beyond ourselves. You chuckle, thinking of modern temples, like stadiums or malls, chasing that same eternal vibe. Their legacy isn't just stone, it's the spark of ambition, faith, and genius that still lights our world. You glance up, the Parthenon's columns framing the stars, and feel the weight of their story settle in. The night grows softer now, the temple's edges blurring as your eyelids grow heavy. Let the cool marble and distant owl hoots fade into a gentle hum. You've walked with gods, artists, and dreamers, seen their grand shrines rise and endure. The stars above Athens twinkle like they did millennia ago, whispering that some stories never end. Close your eyes, let the breeze carry you, and drift into dreams where columns still stand tall, gleaming under a timeless sky. Sleep well, traveler.